Welcome to the channel, The Revenge of Slaves. In the summer of 1856, the Mississippi sun hung over Blackwood Plantation like a judgment that refused to be postponed. The air itself seemed thick enough to swallow you whole, pressing down on everything with an oppressive weight that made breathing feel like a luxury rather than a necessity. The cotton fields stretched endlessly toward the horizon, their white bowls gleaming under a sky so painfully blue it hurt to look upon for more than a moment. 300 acres of wealth, of privilege, of lives bought and sold and measured in columns of numbers that had nothing to do with humanity. This was the domain of Margaret Sutton, a widow of 48 years who had inherited the property upon her husband's passing in 1852. Tall and angular, with gray eyes that seemed to pierce through whatever they rested upon, and a mouth that rarely curved into anything resembling warmth, she had transformed the plantation into a model of efficiency that would make any businessman proud. She kept meticulous records, every expense logged, every bale of cotton accounted for, every enslaved person cataloged with their assessed value carefully noted. To Margaret, the plantation represented a business enterprise above all else. The people who worked its fields were inventory, assets to be maintained or discarded based on their productivity. Her late husband's ledgers had been thorough, but Margaret refined his system into something approaching artistry. The economics of the operation were brutally simple. A healthy adult male slave commanded approximately $1,200 on the open market. A strong woman might bring $800 to $1,000, depending on her age and apparent fertility. Children were worth less, their value increasing as they grew and demonstrated their capacity for labor. In Margaret's careful calculations, a sickly child might be valued at $100 or even less, not worth the investment of resources required to raise them to productive adulthood. Sara Sutton carried Margaret's surname not through any familial connection, but through the simple fact of ownership. She had been born on the plantation in 1847, the daughter of a woman named Ruth who had been valued at $900 in the ledger of Margaret's departed husband. Ruth had died, bringing Sara into the world, reducing the plantation's assets by $900 while adding only $250 in return. From a purely business perspective, Sara's birth represented a net loss of $650. Margaret's husband had noted this fact with evident displeasure, circling the figures and adding a terse comment about diminishing returns. From her very first breath, Sara was marked as different. She arrived small, barely 5 pounds, and grew slowly despite whatever nourishment could be provided. Her skin was notably lighter than most of the enslaved children, suggesting a white father, though nobody ever spoke openly about who that might have been. Whispers circulated about Margaret's late husband, but such speculations were dangerous. Questions that cut too close to uncomfortable truths had a way of resulting in sales to distant plantations or worse. By age 9, Sara stood barely 4 feet tall and weighed perhaps 50 pounds. She appeared more like a child of 6 than one approaching the decade mark. Her eyes were large and dark, holding an expression of weary wisdom that seemed entirely inappropriate for someone so young. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was so soft that people had to lean close to catch her words. She never played with the other children, never ran or laughed, or sang the songs that drifted from the quarters at night. She simply worked slowly and carefully, making herself as invisible as possible in a world where visibility often meant vulnerability. Margaret referred to her as the weak one and made notes in her ledger suggesting that Sara's value might need to be adjusted downward if her condition didn't improve. The overseer, a brutal man named Coleman Briggs, called her worse things. Briggs was 35 years old, built like a bull with hands that had broken many bones and a whip that he employed with disturbing frequency. He earned $60 per month plus room and board, making him one of the highest paid overseers in Yazoo County. He had worked at Blackwood for 6 years, securing his position through a combination of cruelty and efficiency that Margaret found admirable. Briggs believed that enslaved people were animals that needed to be broken, and he took pride in his ability to break even the strongest spirits. His reputation stretched across 3 counties as the man who could make any plantation profitable by extracting maximum productivity from workers. His methods were brutal but effective, at least in the short term. During his tenure at Blackwood, cotton production increased by 40%. That he had also buried 23 workers during that same period, including 7 children, was considered an acceptable cost of doing business. But Sara confused him. You couldn't break someone who never fought back. You couldn't instill fear in someone who seemed already terrified of everything. You couldn't motivate someone who appeared to have given up on life before it had truly begun. So he simply made her work harder, pushed her past what her small body could handle, hoping she would either toughen up or die. The other enslaved people at Blackwood watched Sara with a mixture of pity and frustration. An old woman named Esther, who had been at the plantation for 40 years and was now valued at only $150 due to her age and declining strength, tried to look after Sara whenever possible. Esther had been purchased in 1816 for $600, considered prime breeding stock at age 20. She had given birth to 11 children over 25 years. 8 had been sold away. 3 had died in childhood. She had earned the plantation thousands of dollars in value through her children, yet now that she was old and worn out, she was worth barely more than the sickly child she tried to protect. There was a young man named Daniel, perhaps 20 years old, valued at $1,200 in Margaret's ledger. Strong and intelligent, he was worth his high price, with years of productive labor ahead of him. Born on the plantation to 2 valued workers, he had grown into exactly the kind of asset Margaret prized. He could pick 200 pounds of cotton per day during peak season. He could repair equipment. He could read numbers and keep basic records, making him useful for more than just field work. Daniel often worked near Sara in the fields. He would try to help her, carrying her cotton sack when it became too heavy, taking over her row when she fell behind. But Briggs noticed everything, and helping someone else meant both people received punishment. Briggs understood that solidarity among enslaved people was dangerous. Workers who helped each other might begin thinking of themselves as a community with shared interests rather than as individual assets. So he made certain to crush any signs of cooperation, keeping everyone isolated and afraid. Still, Daniel tried. He couldn't help himself. Something about Sara's quiet suffering touched something deep within him, making him angry at the injustice of it all in a way that was dangerous for an enslaved man to feel. His mother had warned him to keep his head down, to be grateful for his health and strength, to not waste emotion on things he couldn't change. But watching Sara struggle day after day, watching this child work herself to death for people who saw her as worth less than a decent horse, made him want to fight back in ways that would surely get him killed. The cotton harvest season ran from August through October, the busiest and most important time of year for Blackwood Plantation. The entire year's profit depended on getting the cotton picked, processed, and shipped to market. In 1856, cotton sold for approximately 11 cents per pound. A good worker picking 150 pounds per day generated about $16.50 worth of cotton per day over a 90-day harvest season. That single worker could produce almost $1,500 in revenue. Subtract the annual cost of feeding, housing, and clothing that worker, approximately $73, and the profit margin was substantial. This is why plantation owners pushed their workers so hard during harvest. This is why they calculated everything down to the penny. This is why a child like Sara, who could only pick 30 or 40 pounds per day, generating perhaps $3 or $4 worth of cotton daily, barely covering her own maintenance costs, was seen as a liability. In the cold mathematics of slavery, she didn't make economic sense. Each enslaved person at Blackwood was expected to pick between 150 and 200 pounds of cotton per day. Adults who picked less faced punishment, usually whipping, sometimes worse. Briggs kept careful records, weighing each person's cotton at the end of each day, recording the amounts, comparing them to quotas. Those who exceeded their quotas occasionally received small rewards, an extra bit of food, a Sunday afternoon off, a word of praise. Those who fell short faced consequences that escalated with each failure. Children under 10 were expected to pick at least 75 pounds per day. Sara had never once met this quota. On her best days, she managed perhaps 40 pounds. Most days, it was closer to 30. Every day she fell short. Margaret docked her food rations by an amount proportional to her shortfall. If she picked 40 pounds instead of 75, she received about half rations that night. The logic was simple. If you don't produce enough to justify your food, you get less food. That this created a downward spiral where underpaid workers became weaker and less productive, which led to more food reduction, which led to more weakness. Didn't concern Margaret. The weak were supposed to die. That was nature's way. That was how you bred strong stock. Briggs added punishments of his own. He would make Sara work through meal breaks, would assign her to the hottest, most difficult rows, would stand over criticizing, mocking, sometimes cuffing her on the back of the head when she moved too slowly. He told her she was worthless, that she was stealing from the plantation, that she should be grateful Mrs. Sutton didn't just sell her to the sugar fields of Louisiana where she would be dead within a year. August 15th, 1856 began like any other day. The sun rose hot and angry, the sky already bright at 5 in the morning when the bell rang calling everyone to the fields. Sara dragged herself out of the small cabin she shared with Esther and 5 other women. The cabin measured approximately 16 by 20 feet, housing 7 people. Each person had about 46 square feet of space, roughly equivalent to a modern prison cell. The cabin had no windows, just gaps in the walls for ventilation, no furniture except for rough sleeping platforms, no privacy, no comfort. Sara hadn't slept well. She never slept well. Her body hurt all the time now, a constant ache in her bones and muscles that never went away. She was coughing more lately, a dry hack that made her chest hurt and brought up flexibla sometimes. Esther said it was the cotton dust, said lots of children got sick from breathing it in day after day, year after year. The tiny fibers got into your lungs and never came out, causing constant irritation and infection. Some people got better. Most didn't. Esther had seen it happen dozens of times over 40 years. A child would start coughing, would get weaker, would waste away over months or years until they just stopped breathing. Sara stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness and joined the line of people walking to the fields. Nobody talked much in the morning. Everyone was too tired, too hungry, too focused on getting through another day. They walked in silence, ghosts moving through the gray light, heading toward another day of brutal labor under a brutal sun for the benefit of people who saw them as livestock. By noon, Sara had picked perhaps 15 pounds of cotton. Her small fingers, cut and bleeding from the sharp cotton bolls that tore skin with every handful, moved as fast as she could make them move. Each bowl required both hands to open, to extract the cotton without leaving pieces behind, to stuff it into the sack that dragged behind her, growing heavier with each row. Her back screamed with pain from bending over constantly. The sun was merciless, beating down with a heat that made the air shimmer and dance. She had been given 1 cup of water at sunrise and wouldn't receive another until sunset 12 hours later. This was standard practice during harvest season. Water breaks took time away from picking. Margaret had calculated that allowing water breaks reduced daily productivity by approximately 8%. Therefore, workers received water twice a day, morning and evening, and were expected to manage. That people sometimes collapsed from heat and dehydration was regrettable but acceptable. The cost of lost productivity from water breaks was higher than the occasional cost of a dead worker. Sara's mouth was so dry her tongue stuck to her teeth. She felt dizzy, like the world was tilting, like the ground wasn't quite where it should be. Her vision kept blurring. She had to stop and close her eyes, breathe deep, fight the urge to just lie down in the dirt and not get up. But lying down meant punishment, meant Briggs would come with his whip or his fists, meant less food tonight. So she kept working, kept picking, her small hands moving slower and slower as the heat and exhaustion took their toll. Briggs rode through the fields on his horse around 1 in the afternoon, checking on workers, counting filled sacks. He carried a small scale, would randomly weigh sacks to make sure people weren't padding them with dirt or rocks, something desperate workers sometimes tried. He also carried his whip coiled on his saddle and a pistol on his hip. The pistol was loaded. He had used it twice in 6 years, shooting workers who tried to run. Both had died. Both deaths were ruled justified self-defense. A slave trying to escape was legally considered to be stealing themselves, and deadly force to prevent theft was permitted. When Briggs reached Sara's row, he dismounted and grabbed her nearly empty sack. He weighed it in his hand, his face darkening. 15 pounds. In 8 hours, you picked 15 pounds. His voice carried across the field, loud and angry, meant to be heard by everyone. Other workers stopped to watch, dreading what would come next, but unable to look away. They had seen this scene before many times with different children. It always ended the same way. Sara stared at the ground, swaying slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm trying my best." Her voice was so quiet Briggs had to lean in to hear it. This made him even angrier. He hated when they were submissive like this, when they wouldn't even fight back enough to make punishment satisfying. Your best is 15 pounds. You know what you cost this plantation. You know what Mrs. Sutton pays to feed your worthless mouth." He grabbed her arm and yanked her upright, shaking her. 20 cents a day. That's what it costs to keep you alive. 20 cents a day for food and housing and the clothes on your back. You know what 15 pounds of cotton is worth? $1.65. You know how many days it takes you to earn enough to pay for 1 day of food? About 8 days. You're stealing from this plantation. You're stealing food from people who work hard, who earn their keep. You're a thief. The math was accurate, but deliberately misleading. It didn't account for the fact that Sara had been forced into this work, that she was 9 years old, that she was sick and underfed. It didn't account for the fact that she never asked to be born into slavery, never agreed to this arrangement, had no choice in any of it. But none of that mattered to Briggs. In his worldview, enslaved people existed to produce profit. Those who didn't produce enough had no value and therefore no right to complain about their treatment. Briggs dragged Sara to the center of the field where everyone could see. This was standard practice. Punishment was meant to be public, to serve as a warning to others, to maintain fear and control. He pulled out his whip, a braided leather thing about 5 feet long that could strip skin from flesh with a single strike. Maybe pain will motivate you. Maybe if your back hurts more than your arms, you'll work faster to make it stop. Esther started forward from where she had been working 3 rows over, but Daniel grabbed her arm, held her back. His eyes were full of pain, but he shook his head. Getting involved would just mean 2 people getting whipped instead of 1. Or worse. They had all learned this lesson before. You couldn't save everyone. Sometimes you couldn't save anyone. All you could do was survive and hope tomorrow would be better, though it rarely was. Briggs raised the whip high, his arm pulling back for maximum force. Sara stood very still, not running, not crying, just waiting for the pain she knew was coming. She had been whipped before, many times. She knew what it felt like, how the skin would split and burn, how the blood would run down her back, how she would have to sleep on her stomach for days while the wounds tried to heal, often getting infected in the dirty conditions of the cabin. She knew all of this and accepted it because what choice did she have? But before Briggs could bring the whip down, Sara collapsed. She just fell to the ground like someone had cut her strings, like a puppet with no one to hold it up. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only whites. Her body went completely limp, folding in on itself as she crumpled into the dirt. She didn't catch herself, didn't put her hands out, just felt like a dead thing. Briggs stood there for a moment, whip still raised. Confused by this development, he kicked with his boot, not gently. Get up right now, or I'll make it worse. I'll whip you until you can't walk. But Sara didn't move, didn't respond at all. Her chest was moving but barely, shallow breaths that seemed too weak to sustain life. Her skin was pale, almost gray. Her lips were turning blue. Daniel broke free from his row and ran over before anyone could stop him. He knew he would be punished for this, but he didn't care. He knelt beside Sara and put his hand on her chest, feeling for her heartbeat. It was there, but wrong, irregular and weak, like it might stop at any moment. She's not breathing right. Something's really wrong with her. She needs the doctor. She's really sick. Briggs kicked Daniel hard in the ribs, knocking him aside. Get back to work or you'll join her on the ground. But Daniel stayed where he was, protecting Sara's body with his own. She's dying. Can't you see that? She's dying right here in the dirt. At least let her die somewhere with shade. At least give her that much. Briggs looked at Sara's still form and cursed under his breath. If she died in the field from a whipping, there would be questions. Margaret didn't like losing property, even worthless property worth only $250. There would be investigations, reports, maybe problems with the law. If someone made a fuss about it, better to let the doctor deal with it. Let her die somewhere out of sight, somewhere the blame could be deflected. He called for 2 other workers to carry Sara to the plantation house. Take her to Dr. Merritt. Let him figure out what's wrong with her, and he pointed at Daniel. Get back to work. I'll deal with you later. Daniel watched as they carried Sara away. Her small body so light she looked like she weighed nothing at all, like she was already a ghost. He had a terrible feeling he would never see her alive again. The plantation doctor was a man named Thomas Merritt, 72 years old, who had been practicing medicine for 40 years. He charged Margaret $30 per year to be on call for medical issues at Blackwood. This worked out to about 8 cents per day, making him one of the cheaper expenses of running the plantation. It was easy money for minimal work. Most of his treatments involved bleeding patients, which required no expensive medicines, or giving them laudanum, which cost about $2 per bottle and could be stretched for months. Dr. Merritt wasn't particularly skilled, having received his medical training through a brief apprenticeship 30 years earlier rather than formal schooling. But in rural Mississippi in 1856, skilled doctors were rare and expensive. Doctors who would treat enslaved people at all were even rarer. Most proper physicians considered it beneath them to treat slaves, seeing it as veterinary work rather than real medicine. So plantation owners made do with men like Merritt, who asked few questions, kept poor records, and didn't care if their patients lived or died. They laid Sara on the floor of the doctor's room in the main house. Not on a bed or examination table, just the floor. The bed was for white patients. The floor was sufficient for enslaved people. Dr. Merritt examined her briefly, his movements slow and careless. He checked her pulse by pressing 2 fingers against her wrist. It was there, but weak and irregular, sometimes seeming to stop for several seconds before starting again. He listened to her chest by pressing his ear against her rib cage. He heard fluid in her lungs, a wet rattling sound that indicated pneumonia or something similar. He pulled back her eyelids and saw her eyes had rolled back, showing mostly white with just a sliver of brown visible. He checked her temperature by pressing his hand against her forehead. She was burning with fever, her skin hot and dry. He checked her hands and feet and found them cold, the blood retreating from her extremities as her body tried to preserve her core. This was a bad sign. It meant her body was shutting down, prioritizing vital organs over everything else, a desperate measure that often preceded death. Margaret stood in the doorway watching, her arms crossed, her face showing irritation rather than concern. This was an inconvenience, an interruption to her day. Well, what's wrong with her? Stood up slowly, his knees creaking with age. She has pneumonia, I believe. Her lungs are full of fluid. Combined with exhaustion, dehydration, malnutrition, and heat exposure, her body is failing. She's in what we call systemic collapse. Multiple organ systems shutting down simultaneously. Margaret's face showed no emotion. She had heard similar diagnoses before. Workers died regularly on plantations. It was a normal part of doing business. Can you fix her? The question was asked the same way she might ask if you could fix a broken tool. Dr. Merritt shrugged, wiping his hands on his pants. I can try, but honestly, Mrs. Sutton, I'm not confident it would be successful. The medicine alone would cost about $5. Quinine for the fever, laudanum for the pain, perhaps some stimulants to strengthen her heart. The nursing care would take time away from more valuable workers. Someone would have to sit with her, give her water, keep her cool, monitor her condition. That's lost productivity. He paused, doing his own calculations. And even with treatment, I'd say her chances of survival are less than half. Probably closer to 1 in 3. She's been weak her whole life. This might just be nature taking its course. Sometimes the weak ones need to die so resources aren't wasted on them. That's just how the world works. Margaret did the math in her head quickly. $5 for medicine, perhaps another $5 in lost productivity from whoever had to nurse Sara. $10 total to maybe save a girl worth $250. But only if she recovered fully and became a productive worker, which seemed unlikely given her history. If she recovered but stayed weak, she might never be worth more than $150 or even $100, making the investment a loss. And there was a 2 in 3 chance she would die anyway, making the entire $10 wasted. The smart business decision was clear. Don't waste the medicine, Margaret said. Her voice was firm, final. Make her comfortable. If she Dies she dies, God's will. This was a common phrase among slaveholders, attributing death to divine providence rather than their own decisions. It made it easier to live with. Merritt nodded. He had expected this answer. He had given similar advice dozens of times, and Margaret had always taken it. Why waste resources on a failing asset? Better to cut your losses. He gave Sara a small dose of laudanum, maybe a quarter teaspoon, just enough to dull her pain slightly, but not enough to waste valuable medicine on someone unlikely to survive. Then he left her lying on the floor and went to have his dinner. It was 3 p.m. on August 15th, 1856. By 6 p.m, Sarah's condition had worsened significantly. Her fever had spiked higher, her skin now so hot it was almost painful to touch. Her breathing had become even more shallow and irregular, sometimes stopping completely for 10 or 15 seconds before starting again with a wet, rattling gasp. She hadn't regained consciousness. She hadn't moved at all except for occasional twitches and convulsions as her body fought its losing battle. Dr. Merritt checked on her once more around 7 p.m. and shook his head with certainty. She'll be gone by morning, probably much sooner, maybe an hour or 2 at most. He told Betty, one of the house servants valued at $600, who served as a maid and occasional nurse, to watch the body and let him know when Sara passed so he could sign the death certificate. Betty sat on a stool in the corner, watching this child die, feeling helpless and sad, but not surprised. She had watched many people die over her 30 years at Blackwood. Death was common here, expected, almost routine. At 8:35 p.m., Sara Sutton stopped breathing. Her chest, which had been moving in those shallow, irregular breaths, went still. Betty waited a full minute watching, but there was no movement. She called for Dr. Merritt, who came down grumbling about being interrupted during his evening reading. He checked for a pulse in Sarah's wrist. Nothing. He held a small hand mirror to her mouth, watching for fog from breath. The mirror stayed clear. He pressed his ear to her chest, listening for a heartbeat. Complete silence. Dr. Merritt pronounced Sara dead at 8:35 p.m., August 15th, 1856. Cause of death, a pneumonia complicated by chronic weakness and multiple contributing factors. He recorded it carefully in his medical ledger, where he kept records of births, deaths, and treatments at Blackwood. Sara Sutton became entry number 437 in that ledger, one of 38 deaths he had recorded in his 6 years serving the plantation. Most were children or elderly slaves. A few were adults who had been worked to death or died from accidents or disease. All were noted with the same clinical detachment, just facts and figures, dates and causes. Margaret was informed while she ate her dinner. She barely looked up from her roasted chicken and vegetables. Have them bury her behind the barn. No point wasting space in the cemetery, and do it quickly. This heat will make the body deteriorate rapidly. This was not unusual. Enslaved people who died were often buried quickly in unmarked graves, especially children, especially sick ones who hadn't been productive. They weren't considered worthy of the space or ceremony afforded to white people or even to valuable adult slaves who had earned some measure of respect through years of hard work. The cemetery Margaret referenced was reserved for white people and occasionally for extremely valuable or long-serving slaves who had been favorites of the family. It had proper headstones, maintained plots, regular care. The area behind the barn was different. It was where dead animals were buried, where broken equipment was discarded, where anything considered waste was dumped and forgotten. Burying Sara, there was a final insult, a last statement about her worth. Coleman Briggs was given the task of organizing the burial. He picked 2 workers, James and Moses, gave them shovels, and told them to dig a hole 4 feet deep behind the barn. He didn't provide a coffin. Coffins cost money, at least $5 to $10 for even a basic pine box. That was money Margaret wouldn't waste on a child who had cost the plantation more than she produced. He just had them wrap Sara's body in an old piece of canvas that had once been used to cover cotton bales but was now too damaged to be useful. The burial took less than an hour. James and Moses, both men in their 30s, dug the grave in silence, working quickly in the fading light. They had buried people before, too many people. The ground behind the barn was soft from previous burials, easy to dig. They dug down about 4 feet, creating a hole roughly 6 feet long and 2 feet wide, just barely big enough for Sara's small body. They placed her in the ground, still wrapped in canvas, her face covered. No ceremony, no prayers, nothing. Briggs wouldn't allow it. Religious services for slaves had to be approved and supervised, and he wasn't going to waste time on a child who had been more trouble than she was worth. James and Moses filled the dirt back in, covering Sarah's body, patting it down flat. By 10 in the evening, it was finished. Sara Sutton was in the ground, 4 feet of Mississippi dirt between her and the world, forgotten before the dirt had fully settled. As I watched from the quarters, tears running down her face. She had wanted to say goodbye, wanted to wash Sarah's body properly, according to the traditions her own grandmother had taught her, wanted to say a prayer over her grave. But she hadn't been allowed. None of the enslaved people had been allowed to participate in the burial. It was done quickly, efficiently, without sentiment or respect. Just another dead slave, another loss to be noted in the ledger and forgotten. Daniel stood beside Esther, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth hurt. His hands were balled into fists at his sides. She deserved better, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't express more openly. She deserved so much better than this. Esther nodded, wiping her eyes. They all deserve better, child. Every single person who dies in this place deserves better. But this is the world we live in. This is what they think we're worth. Less than animals, less than dirt. They stood there until full dark, watching the unmarked grave, saying their own quiet prayers, mourning a child they had known for 9 years who had never been allowed to truly live. Then they went back to their cabin because the work bell would ring again at 5 in the morning, and they had to be ready. Life at Blackwood Plantation continued. The cotton didn't stop growing because a child died. The work didn't pause for grief. Everything just moved forward like Sarah had never existed. The next day, August 16th, life returned to normal. People went to the fields. Cotton was picked. Quotas were enforced. Margaret noted Sarah's death in her ledger with a simple entry: Sara Sutton, age 9, died August 15, 1856. Loss of asset value, $2.50. She would claim it as a business loss on her taxes, perhaps reducing her burden by a few dollars. The grave behind the barn was unmarked and already starting to sink slightly as the dirt settled and compressed. August 17th passed the same way. Work, heat, exhaustion, sleep. Repeat. Nobody talked about Sarah. Talking about the dead was considered bad luck, and besides, what was there to say? Another child had died. It happened all the time. You mourned if you could. You moved on because you had to, and you hoped you wouldn't be next. But on August 18th, 3 days after Sarah's burial, something happened that would change everything at Blackwood Plantation. The night of August 18th was hot and still, the air heavy with moisture that promised rain but never delivered. There was no breeze, no relief from the oppressive heat even after the sun went down. Most people at Blackwood were asleep by 9 in the evening, exhausted from another brutal day of labor. The few who were still awake, sitting outside their cabins, trying to find some cooler air, heard at first a sound that didn't belong, a scraping sound like something digging or clawing, coming from the direction of the barn. At first they thought it was an animal, maybe a dog or raccoon getting into something, but then the sound got louder, more deliberate, more purposeful. And the dogs, all 6 of them that lived around the plantation, started barking, all of them, all at once, in a way that made your skin crawl, in a way that spoke of primal fear rather than territorial aggression. This wasn't their normal barking at an intruder or another animal. This was different. This was the sound dogs make when they sense something fundamentally wrong, something that violates the natural order. They barked and howled, backing away from the barn, hackles raised, some of them trembling. One of the dogs urinated in fear, which dogs don't do unless they're absolutely terrified. James, one of the house servants, valued at $700, who often had night duties, grabbed a lantern and went to investigate. He called to the dogs to be quiet, but they wouldn't stop, wouldn't even come near him. They just stood at a distance, continuing their fear, crazed barking, looking towards something behind the barn that James couldn't see yet. He walked slowly around the building, holding the lantern high, his heart beating faster with each step, though he couldn't say why. The air felt wrong somehow, colder than it should be, heavy with something he couldn't name. He saw the graves first, 3 small mounds, where people had been buried over the past 2 months. The dirt on 2 of them was undisturbed, settled, and smooth. But the third one, the newest one, Sarah's grave, was different. The dirt had been disturbed, more than disturbed, There was a hole coming up from below, like something had dug its way out from the inside. And as James got closer, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, he saw something that made him drop the lantern, that made him scream louder than he had ever screamed in his life. A small hand, pale in the moonlight, sticking up out of the dirt. Fingers moving, grasping, pulling, and beneath the hand, a face covered in dirt, eyes open, mouth gasping for air. Sara Sutton was climbing out of her grave. James's scream cut through the night like a knife, waking half the plantation. People came running from all directions, from the slave quarters and the main house, carrying lanterns and torches, asking what was wrong, what happened. Why was James screaming like someone was being murdered? He couldn't answer. He just stood there pointing at the grave with a shaking hand, his mouth moving but no words coming out, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. Coleman Briggs arrived first from the overseer's house, pulling on his pants, carrying his rifle, ready for trouble. He pushed through the gathering crowd, cursing everyone for the disturbance, demanding to know what fool woke him up in the middle of the night. Then he saw what James was pointing at and stopped dead in his tracks. His rifle lowered slowly. His face went pale in the torchlight. Behind him, more people gathered, enslaved workers and white staff members, all carrying lights, all pushing forward to see what caused such commotion. The crowd grew to 20, then 30, then 40 people, all standing in a semicircle around the grave site, all staring at something impossible, something that violated every natural law they understood about life and death. Sara Sutton was pulling herself up and out of her grave. Her movements were slow but deliberate, purposeful. Both hands now gripped the edge of the hole, her thin arms straining as she hauled herself upward. Dirt fell off her in clumps, cascading down the burial canvas that still partially wrapped her small body. Her hair was matted with soil, thick and dark and wet, looking in the moonlight. Her dress, the simple slave clothing she had died in, was torn and filthy, stained with 3 days of burial. But her eyes were what made everyone take an involuntary step backward. Her eyes were open clear and focused in a way they never had been during her life. They seemed to glow slightly in the torchlight, reflecting the flames in a way that human eyes shouldn't. She looked around at all the shocked faces staring at her, making eye contact with person after person, and in each gaze was something that made grown men and women feel like children caught doing something terrible. She pulled herself completely out of the hole and stood on shaky legs beside her own grave. She was so small, so thin, covered in dirt from head to toe, looking more like a ghost or spirit than a living child. For a long moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the dogs continuing their terrified barking from a safe distance and the crackling of torches in the still night air. It was impossible. Everyone knew it was impossible. Sara Sutton had been dead. Merritt had pronounced her dead 3 days ago. He had checked her pulse multiple times, held a mirror to her mouth, listened to her chest. She had no heartbeat, no breath, no signs of life whatsoever. They had buried her 4 feet underground, wrapped in canvas. No air could get into that grave, no water, no food. A person could not survive being buried for 3 days. It was medically, physically, scientifically impossible. Yet here she stood, breathing, moving, alive. Esther was the first to break from the crowd. She pushed through the stunned onlookers and ran to Sara, falling to her knees in front of the girl. Her hands reached out but hesitated, afraid to touch, afraid this was a ghost or hallucination, afraid that touching would make it disappear. "Child, Sarah, is that really you? Are you really alive?" Her voice was shaking, tears already streaming down her weathered face. Sara looked down at Esther and nodded slowly. When she spoke, her voice was different from before. It was still quiet, but it carried strength now, certainty, a quality it had never possessed during her short life. Her vocal cords were raw and damaged from 3 days without water, making her voice rough and scratchy. But somehow that made it more commanding, more serious. "Yes, Esther, it's me. I'm alive. I came back." The words hung in the air like smoke. I came back. Not, I woke up or I survived. I came back, as if death had been a place she visited and then left, as if she had made a choice to return rather than simply never having been fully dead. The distinction was subtle, but everyone felt it, that sense that this was something more than a medical mistake or miraculous recovery. Dr. Merritt was called immediately. Someone ran to wake him, pounding on his door until he stumbled out in his nightshirt, grumbling about being disturbed, about how plantation owners never let doctors sleep properly. He was 72 years old, and sleep didn't come easy anymore. He needed his rest. But when the servant grabbed his arm and dragged him toward the barn, stammering about Sara Sutton being alive, Dr. Merritt went from annoyed to terrified in seconds. He arrived at the grave site, breathing hard from the exertion, his old heart pounding. When he saw Sara standing there covered in dirt, but clearly alive and conscious, his face went white as chalk, his legs almost gave out. Someone had to catch his arm to steady him. He had pronounced her dead. He had signed the certificate. He had been absolutely, completely, professionally certain. But there she was, standing and breathing and looking at him with those strange, knowing eyes. Dr. Merritt rushed forward, his medical training overriding his fear. He grabbed Sara's wrist, pressing his fingers against the pulse point. It was there, strong and steady, beating at about 70 beats per minute, perfectly normal for a child her age. He pressed his ear against her chest, listening. Her heart was beating regularly. No irregularities, no signs of the failure he had diagnosed 3 days ago. He pulled back her eyelids to examine her pupils. They were normal, reactive to the torchlight. No sign of the rolled-back death state he had observed. He checked her temperature by pressing his hand against her forehead and neck. She was warm, normal body temperature, not the cold stillness of death or the burning fever that had consumed her before. He checked her hands and feet. Blood flow was good. Color was returning. Fingers and toes moved normally when he asked her to wiggle them. He listened to her lungs. They were clear. No fluid, no rattling, no sign of the pneumonia that had been killing her 72 hours ago. This is impossible, Dr. Merritt whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. You were dead. I checked 3 times, 4 times even. You had no pulse, no heartbeat, no breath. Your body was cold. Your eyes were fixed and dilated. You were dead by every medical standard I know. He was shaking now, his professional certainty shattered, his entire understanding of medicine and biology called into question by this small, dirt-covered child. Sara looked at him with those clear, focused eyes that seemed far too old for her face. I was dead, Dr. Merritt. You weren't wrong. Your examination was correct. My heart stopped beating at 8:35 p.m. on August 15th. My breathing stopped. My brain stopped receiving oxygen. I died. She spoke with certainty, with knowledge that a 9-year-old girl shouldn't possess. But death isn't always final. Sometimes death can be reversed. Sometimes what's gone can come back. Margaret Sutton arrived then, wrapped in a robe despite the heat, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, her face showing fury at being woken in the middle of the night. She had been sleeping poorly lately, troubled by dreams she couldn't quite remember upon waking, and this disturbance had pulled her from the first deep sleep she'd had in days. She pushed through the crowd of enslaved people and staff, demanding to know what was happening, what emergency required waking the entire plantation at this ungodly hour. When she saw Sara alive and standing by her grave, Margaret stopped mid-sentence. Her mouth hung open, her eyes went wide. For several long seconds, she couldn't process what she was seeing. Her brain refused to accept it, kept insisting this must be someone else, some other girl, because Sara Sutton was dead and buried 3 days ago. But she recognized the face even covered in dirt. She recognized the small, thin frame. She recognized the torn dress that had been Sara's only clothing. Margaret's expression went from confusion to something that might have been fear, though she would never have admitted it. She was a practical woman who believed in facts and figures, in things that could be measured and calculated. Death was final. Dead people stayed dead. That was a fundamental rule of existence, possibly the most fundamental rule. Yet here was evidence that challenged that rule, that suggested reality was more complicated and terrifying than her neat ledgers and calculations allowed for. Explain this, Margaret demanded, her voice sharp, but with a tremor underneath that betrayed her composure. Someone explain this right now. Dr. Merritt, what happened? How is this possible? She looked around at the crowd, at the faces showing shock and fear and something else, something that looked like hope or vindication, expressions she didn't like seeing on enslaved faces. Dr. Merritt stammered, trying to form words, trying to construct an explanation that made sense within his understanding of medicine. It could have been catalepsy, a rare condition where the body enters a death-like state but isn't actually dead. The vital signs become so weak they're nearly undetectable. Breathing slows to perhaps 1 breath per minute, heartbeat to maybe 5 or 6 beats per minute. It mimics death perfectly. I must have missed it. I must have made a mistake in my diagnosis. He was grasping at straws and everyone knew it. Catalepsy didn't explain how someone could survive 3 days buried underground with no air. Even if Sara had been in a cataleptic state when buried, she would have suffocated within minutes once the dirt was piled on top of her. The canvas wrapping would have blocked any tiny amount of air that might have filtered through the soil. There was no medical explanation for this. None at all. Briggs stepped forward, his rifle gripped tight in his hands. He had recovered from his initial shock and was now angry, as he always was when confronted with something he didn't understand. Anger was easier than fear. Anger was something he knew how to handle. Maybe she wasn't all the way dead. Maybe she was just mostly dead and woke up in the ground and dug herself out. But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. He had helped bury her. He knew how deep the grave was, how much dirt they had piled on top. A grown man would struggle to dig out from that depth. A small, sick 9-year-old girl. Impossible. Sara looked at Coleman Briggs, and he actually took a step backward despite himself. Despite his size and strength and the rifle in his hands, there was something in her gaze that stripped away his bravado, that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. I didn't dig out, Mr. Briggs. The earth released me. It didn't want me. Death sent me back. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. Everyone in the crowd heard her clearly. I was in darkness for a long time, cold and alone. I couldn't breathe, but I didn't need to. I couldn't move, but I didn't hurt. I just existed in nothing for what felt like forever. She turned slowly, looking at all the faces gathered around her. Then something spoke to me. I don't know what it was. A voice without sound. It said, I could stay there in the dark, or I could go back. But if I went back, I would have to finish something. I would have to make things right. I would have to show them. She looked directly at Margaret now. Show them what they did. Show them what we're worth. Show them that you can't just throw people away like garbage and expect no consequences. The crowd of enslaved people started murmuring, whispers spreading like ripples in water. Some made signs against evil, old gestures their grandparents had brought from Africa, symbols meant to ward off spirits and unnatural things. Some whispered prayers calling on Jesus or older gods, seeking protection from whatever this was. But others looked at Sara with something different in their eyes. Something like recognition, like she represented something they had been waiting for without knowing it. Because they all understood what they were seeing, even if they couldn't explain it. This wasn't a medical mistake. This wasn't someone waking up from a coma. This was something that shouldn't be possible, but was happening anyway. This was the natural order breaking, bending, allowing something through that normally stayed on the other side. This was a resurrection or visitation or possession or something else they had no name for. Whatever it was real, and it was standing in front of them covered in grave dirt. Margaret tried to take control of the situation, tried to impose her authority and restore the order that made her world function. This is nonsense. Superstitious nonsense. The girl was in a coma or cataleptic state. Dr. Merritt made an understandable error in diagnosis. Sara, you were very sick and confused. You woke up disoriented and managed to dig yourself out somehow. That's all. This is a medical mistake and a fortunate survival. Her voice was firm, commanding, but her hands were shaking. Everyone go back to bed. Sara will be examined properly in the morning. This incident is over. But nobody moved. They all just stood there staring at Sara, waiting to see what she would do next, what she would say. The power dynamic had shifted somehow in ways Margaret could feel, but not quite understand. Her words, which normally would have scattered the crowd immediately, had no effect. For the first time in her life, Margaret Sutton stood in front of enslaved people and felt powerless. Sara looked at Margaret for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried absolute certainty. You're lying, Mrs. Sutton, to them and to yourself. You know I was dead. Dr. Merritt knows, Mr. Briggs, everyone here knows. I had no heartbeat, no breathing. I was cold and stiff. I was dead for 3 days. She took a step toward Margaret, and Margaret actually stepped backward, something she would never normally do in front of enslaved people. 3 days ago, you decided I wasn't worth saving. You did the math. $5 for medicine versus $250 of value. You calculated that saving me wasn't a good investment. The crowd was completely silent now. Everyone listening, everyone watching this small child confront the most powerful person on the plantation without fear, without deference, without the submission that had been beaten into them since birth. Sara continued, her voice growing stronger. You put a price on my life and decided it wasn't high enough. You let me die to save $5. You buried me behind the barn like a dead animal because you thought I was worthless. Margaret's face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. That's not how it was. That's not. Medical decisions are complicated. The treatment wouldn't have worked. You were too far gone. I made a practical decision based on expert advice. But her voice was defensive, lacking its usual authority, because Sara was right. That was exactly how it had been. Margaret had done the calculation and decided Sara wasn't worth the cost. Sara smiled, and it was not a child's smile. It was an ancient, carrying weight that no 9-year-old should possess. I know what I'm worth now, Mrs. Sutton. I'm worth more than your whole plantation. I'm worth more than everything you own because I came back from death. I walked in darkness and returned to light. I crossed a threshold that no one crosses, and then crossed it again, going the other direction. I am proof that your calculations are meaningless, that your ledgers don't capture what matters, that you don't control everything you think you control. She spread her arms wide, gesturing at the crowd around her. We are all worth more than the prices you put on us. Every single person here. We're not inventory. We're not assets. We're human beings with souls and dignity, and I came back to prove it. I came back to show everyone what you really are, what you did, what you do every single day to all of us. Margaret tried to speak, but no words came out. She opened her mouth and closed it again, her face cycling through expressions of rage, fear, and confusion. She looked around at the crowd, at her overseer, at her doctor, seeking support, seeking someone to back her up, to restore order. But Briggs was staring at Sara with barely concealed fear. Dr. Merritt was shaking, pale as death, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew about medicine. And the enslaved people were looking at Sara with expressions that terrified Margaret more than anything else. They were looking at her with hope, with belief, with the kind of dangerous faith that could lead to rebellion, to uprising, to the complete collapse of the system that kept them controlled. Hope was the most dangerous thing slaves could have. Hope made them stop accepting their condition. Hope made them start imagining alternatives. Hope made them willing to risk everything for the chance at something better. Briggs finally found his voice, tried to reassert control in the only way he knew how, through threats and violence. He raised his rifle, pointing it at Sara, his finger on the trigger. That's enough. You don't talk to Mrs. Sutton that way. You're still property. You're still a slave. You don't get to make speeches and accusations. This is over right now. He stopped because Sara was looking at him, really looking at him, and her eyes had changed. They were darker now, deeper, like looking into wells with no bottom, like looking into the void between stars. Her pupils seemed to expand until they swallowed the whites of her eyes, until there was nothing but darkness looking out from her small face. You hit me many times, Mr. Briggs. You called me worthless. You said I should die. You said I was stealing food by being alive. You were right about the dying part. Her voice had changed, too, deeper with harmonics that didn't seem to come from human vocal cords. But you were wrong about everything else. Briggs pulled the trigger. The shot rang out loud in the night. The muzzle flashed bright as lightning, the sound echoing off the barn and the main house. Everyone screamed or ducked or dove for cover. The shot was point blank, maybe 10 feet, and Briggs was known as an excellent marksman who could shoot a rabbit at 50 yards. But the bullet didn't hit Sara. It struck the ground 3 feet to her left, kicking up a small spray of dirt. Briggs stared at his rifle in confusion and disbelief. How had he missed? How was that possible? He raised the rifle again, aimed more carefully this time, his hands shaking, but his aim steady. He fired again. This shot went high, whistling over Sara's head by at least 2 feet. He fired a third time, a fourth time, emptying the rifle. Every shot missed, every single one, despite perfect aim, despite a stationary target, despite years of shooting experience. The bullets went everywhere except where they were aimed, like some invisible force was deflecting them, bending their trajectories at the last moment. Sara walked toward Briggs slowly. He backed away, his hands shaking so badly now he'd dropped the empty rifle. His face showed pure terror, all the bravado and cruelty stripped away, leaving just a frightened man confronting something he couldn't understand or control. "Stay away from me, stay away." He turned and ran toward his house, stumbling over his own feet, not looking back, running like a child fleeing a nightmare. Sara didn't chase him. She just watched him go, her expression calm, almost sad. Then she looked at the crowd of enslaved people, and her expression softened. When she spoke again, her voice was back to normal, or as normal as it could be given the circumstances. "I'm not here to hurt you, any of you. I'm not a monster or a demon or anything evil. I'm just Sara. But something happened to me in those 3 days. Something changed me, showed me things, gave me purpose." She looked at Margaret again. "I'm here for the ones who hurt us, the ones who decided our lives don't matter, the ones who treat us like animals or property or numbers in a ledger. It starts with them." She pointed at Margaret. "It starts with the people who make the calculations, who decide who lives and who dies based on profit and loss, who create a system where a child's life is worth less than $5 of medicine." Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out shaky and weak. "You're insane. You're a child having delusions from trauma and oxygen deprivation. Someone grab her and lock her in the barn until morning. We'll deal with this when everyone can think clearly." But nobody moved to grab Sara. Nobody wanted to touch her. Even the white staff members, who normally would have jumped to obey Margaret's orders, stood frozen, unwilling to approach this small girl who had clawed her way out of a grave. Sara looked around at all of them one more time, her gaze lingering on Esther, on Daniel, on the other enslaved people who had known her, who had watched her suffer, who had mourned her death. "I came back to make things right, to show everyone the truth. It won't be quick, and it won't be easy, but it will happen. Justice is coming to Blackwood Plantation. The kind of justice that doesn't care about property laws or economics. The kind that balances the scales no matter what it costs." Then she turned and walked slowly toward the slave quarters, toward the cabin she had shared with Esther. The crowd parted to let her through, people stepping aside quickly, not wanting to block her path. Some reached out as if to touch her, but pulled their hands back at the last moment, afraid or reverent, or both. Sara walked with her head up, her back straight, moving with a confidence and dignity she had never shown in life. She looked like someone who had nothing left to fear because she had already experienced the worst thing possible and survived it. She went into the cabin and lay down on her sleeping mat, the same mat where she had slept for 9 years, where she had died in spirit long before her body gave out. Esther followed her inside, not knowing what else to do, needing to be near this child she had tried to protect and failed to save. Sara closed her eyes and within minutes appeared to be sleeping, her breathing deep and regular, her face peaceful in a way it never had been before. Esther sat beside her, staring at the girl who had died and somehow come back. She reached out carefully and touched Sara's face, half expecting her hand to pass through like Sara was a ghost or spirit. But the skin was solid and warm, real flesh and blood, unmistakably alive. Yet when Esther pulled her hand back, there was dirt on her fingers, dirt from the grave, soil that had covered Sara's body for 3 days, earth that should have been her final resting place. And Esther knew deep in her heart, in the part of her that remembered older beliefs her grandmother had taught her before Christianity tried to replace them, that Sara had told the truth. She had died. She had been somewhere else, somewhere beyond life. And she had come back for a reason. The dead didn't return without purpose. They came back when there were debts unpaid, when justice had been denied, when the scales needed balancing. Outside, the crowd slowly dispersed, people returning to their cabins, but knowing sleep would be impossible. They would lie in their beds and stare at the ceiling and replay what they had witnessed, trying to make sense of it, trying to fit it into their understanding of how the world worked. Some would pray. Some would cry. Some would feel hope for the first time in years. Hope that maybe their suffering wouldn't last forever. Hope that maybe there were forces in the universe that cared about justice even when humans didn't. Margaret stood in front of her house watching the quarters, her mind racing. This had to be explained, had to be rationalized, had to be controlled before it spread beyond the plantation. People didn't come back from the dead. That was superstition, ignorance, primitive beliefs. There had to be a logical explanation, catalepsy, premature burial somehow digging out, something scientific that made sense within the natural laws she understood. But in her heart, in the part of her that still believed in things beyond money and property and profit, in the part she tried to ignore because it interfered with business, Margaret knew something terrible had happened. Something had shifted at Blackwood Plantation on this hot August night. The natural order had been violated. The dead had returned, and whatever came next, whatever consequences followed from that impossible resurrection, would not be in her control. Dr. Merritt sat in his room, staring at the death certificate he had signed 3 days ago. The paper seemed to mock him, every word proof of his failure, evidence that his certainty had been misplaced, that his professional judgment was worthless. Sara Sutton, age 9, died at 8:35 p.m. on August 15, 1856, caused pneumonia and systemic failure. He had signed it, dated it, recorded it in his ledger with absolute confidence. But Sara Sutton was not dead. She was sleeping in the quarters right now, breathing and alive. He had been wrong. Or something impossible had happened. Either way, his hands wouldn't stop shaking. Either way, his entire understanding of medicine and death and the boundary between them had been shattered. He pulled out a bottle of whiskey, something he rarely indulged in, and poured himself a large glass. He needed to dull the fear, needed to stop thinking about what he had seen, needed to forget the look in Sarah's eyes when she said, "I was dead." Coleman Briggs barricaded himself in his room, pushing furniture against the door, loading every gun he owned. He had 6 rifles now ready and 2 pistols, all loaded and primed. He kept the lamps burning, terrified of the dark, terrified of what might be hiding in shadows. Every sound made him jump. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like footsteps. Every movement of curtains in the breeze looked like a small figure standing in the corner. He told himself he wasn't afraid of a child. He had broken grown men, had beaten people who begged for mercy and laughed while doing it. He was strong, powerful, feared by everyone on the plantation. But that thing he had seen, those eyes looking at him, that voice promising consequences, that wasn't a child. That was something else wearing a child's face, and it knew his sins. It knew every time he had hit her, every insult he had spoken, every moment of cruelty. It remembered all of it, and it had come back to collect payment. As dawn approached on August 19th, Blackwood Plantation sat in an uneasy quiet that felt more threatening than any loud disturbance. The sun would rise soon, painting the sky in reds and oranges. People would have to go to the fields. Work would have to continue. Cotton needed picking regardless of what impossible things happened in the night. Margaret would try to restore order, to make everyone forget what they had seen, to explain it away as medical error and mass hysteria and nothing more. But they all knew the truth. Something had come back from death. Something that remembered every cruelty, every injustice, every calculation that valued profit over human life. Something that promised consequences, that spoke of justice and balance and debts that needed paying. And whether it was Sara Sutton returned from the grave or something else using her body, the result was the same. Blackwood Plantation would never be the same again. The morning of August 19th dawned gray and heavy. The sky covered in clouds that threatened rain but delivered none, just hung there oppressive and dark like a ceiling pressing down. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, charged with something electrical and wrong. The plantation felt different, looked different, though nothing physical had changed. It was the atmosphere, the feeling like the land itself knew something terrible had happened and was waiting to see what came next. The bell rang at 5 in the morning, as always, calling people to the fields. But this morning, many were reluctant to leave their cabins. They gathered in small groups, whispering, glancing toward the cabin where Sarah slept, afraid to go near, but unable to look away. The bravest among them approached Esser's cabin and peered through the gaps in the walls, trying to see if Sarah was still there, if she was real, if last night had actually happened, or was some shared fever dream brought on by heat and exhaustion and desperation. Sarah was there, sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling with regular breaths. She looked normal in the morning light, just a small girl who needed to wash the dirt from her hair and skin. but everyone who looked at her felt it, that sense of wrongness, that awareness that this was not the same Sara who had died 3 days ago. Something fundamental had changed. Something essential was different. Margaret Sutton had not slept at all. She sat at her desk in the main house, still in her nightclothes, staring at her ledgers, but not really seeing the numbers. Her mind kept replaying the impossible sight of that child climbing out of her grave, walking and talking after being dead for 3 days. Margaret was a practical woman who believed in facts and figures, in things that could be measured and calculated and controlled. Death was final. Dead people stayed dead. That was a fundamental rule of existence, possibly the most fundamental rule. Yet what she had witnessed had violated that rule so completely, so undeniably, that it shook the foundation of everything she believed. If death wasn't final, if the dead could return, if the natural laws she depended on could be broken so easily, then what else was she wrong about? What other certainties were illusions? What other rules might bend or break when pressed? At 6 a.m, she called for Dr. Merritt and Coleman Briggs to meet her in the study. She needed to discuss the situation, needed to form a plan, needed to reassert control before things spiraled further. Dr. Merritt arrived looking terrible, his eyes red and bloodshot, his hands trembling as he poured himself coffee from the service Margaret's house slaves had prepared. He had aged 10 years overnight, his face drawn and haggard, his confidence shattered. Briggs was worse. He arrived 15 minutes late, which was unprecedented, carrying 2 loaded pistols openly on his belt and a rifle over his shoulder. His eyes were wild, darting around constantly, seeing threats in every shadow. He had dark circles under his eyes from lack of sleep. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by nervous energy and barely controlled fear. He sat across from Margaret's desk but wouldn't put down his weapons, keeping them close, ready. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Margaret spoke, her voice firm, but with a tremor underneath that betrayed her composure. We need to control this situation before it gets worse, before word spreads beyond the plantation, before we have a full panic, or worse, a rebellion. She looked at both men, demanding their attention, demanding they focus. The official story is that Sara was in a cataleptic state. Dr. Merritt made an understandable diagnostic error. She recovered and dug herself out. That's what we tell everyone. That's what goes in all official records. Dr. Merritt nodded eagerly, grateful for any explanation that didn't require him to admit he had witnessed something impossible. Yes, of course. Catalepsy. It's rare but documented in medical literature. The body enters a death-like state. Vital signs become nearly undetectable. I should have recognized it. Should have been more thorough in my examination. My mistake entirely. He was lying to himself and knew it. But lies were easier than truth, when truth meant abandoning everything you thought you understood about the world. Briggs leaned forward, his jaw tight. What about what she said about coming back from death, about making things right? She threatened you directly. Ma'am, that can't be allowed. She needs to be punished severely, needs to be sold south immediately before she causes real trouble, before she infects the others with her crazy talk. His voice carried desperation, the need to remove the source of his fear, to make the threat go away. Margaret considered this. Selling Sara would remove the immediate problem from Blackwood, but it would also spread the story. Every plantation Sara went to, every slave trader who handled her, every enslaved person who heard about her would hear the tale of the girl who died and came back. The story would spread like wildfire through slave communities across the South, passed along the invisible networks of communication that moved information faster than any telegraph. That kind of story was dangerous. It would inspire hope. And hope was the most dangerous thing enslaved people could possess. Hope made them stop accepting their condition. Hope made them believe in alternatives, in possibilities beyond their current suffering. Hope could lead to resistance, to escapes, to rebellions that would cost Margaret everything. The Nat Turner Rebellion 25 years ago had started with a man who believed God had chosen him for a special purpose. What might happen if enslaved people across the South started believing a 9-year-old girl had been resurrected to bring justice to their oppressors? No, Margaret decided firmly. She stays here where we can control her, where we can control the story and make sure it doesn't spread beyond the plantation boundaries. If she's sold, the tale grows with every telling, becomes bigger and more dramatic. Here we can manage it. We can make sure people understand it was a medical error. Nothing supernatural, nothing that should inspire hope or resistance. She looked at both men with determination. Sara is sick, confused, traumatized from her experience of being buried alive. She's saying things that don't make sense because her mind was damaged by oxygen deprivation. We treat her with patience and kindness. Show everyone that we're reasonable and compassionate. We prove that her accusations are the ravings of a confused child. That's how we handle this. But even as Margaret spoke these words with confidence, even as the three of them nodded in agreement about the official story, they all knew they were lying to themselves. They had all seen Sara's eyes, had heard the certainty in her voice, had felt the wrongness of her presence. This wasn't a confused child. This wasn't medical error or oxygen deprivation. This was something else entirely, something that didn't fit into their comfortable explanations and rational worldview. At 7 a.m, Margaret sent for Sara. Esther brought the girl to the main house, walking slowly, Sara's small hand in her weathered one. The child had been washed, the grave dirt removed from her hair and skin, dressed in clean clothes. In the morning light, walking into the plantation house, she looked almost normal, just a thin 9-year-old girl, small for her age, nothing special or frightening about her. But when she entered Margaret's study, when she stood across the desk from the woman who owned her, who had decided she wasn't worth saving, the atmosphere in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop. The air felt heavier. The sunlight coming through the windows seemed dimmer, filtered through something invisible but present. Margaret felt it. Briggs felt it. Dr. Merritt felt it. That sense of being in the presence of something that shouldn't exist. Margaret studied Sara carefully, looking for some sign of the terrifying figure from last night, looking for evidence of disease or damage that would support her explanation of trauma and confusion. But Sara looked back at her with calm, clear eyes, old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen things Margaret couldn't imagine, eyes that judged and found her wanting. "Sara," Margaret began, using her gentlest voice, the tone she reserved for important guests or difficult negotiations. "You gave us all quite a scare last night. Dr. Merritt tells me you were very sick. You fell into a kind of deep sleep called catalepsy that made you seem dead. It's very rare, but it happens. Your mind and body shut down to preserve life. That's why we thought you had died. That's why we buried you. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake, but an understandable one." Margaret leaned forward, trying to seem concerned and caring, rather than calculating. "No, I know you said some things last night that were inappropriate, about dying and coming back, about making things right, about justice. I understand you were confused and frightened. You had just woken up buried alive, which would terrify anyone, especially a child. Your mind was scrambling to make sense of a traumatic experience, so it created this narrative about death and resurrection." She smiled, trying to look warm and motherly, an expression that sat awkwardly on her usually stern face. "But that's not what really happened. You were never actually dead. You were sick, very sick, and you fell into this special kind of sleep. Dr. Merritt made an error which he deeply regrets. We buried you by mistake. You woke up, managed to dig yourself out somehow, and now you're recovering. That's the truth. That's what actually happened. Do you understand?" Sara looked at Margaret without blinking, her gaze steady and unwavering. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried perfect clarity. "You're lying to me, to yourself, to everyone. You know I was dead. You're just afraid to admit it because it breaks your understanding of how the world works. Because it suggests there are forces bigger than you, powers you don't control, consequences you can't calculate away." Margaret's jaw tightened. "I'm trying to be patient with you, trying to understand that you're confused and traumatized, but you will not speak to me that way. You're a child and you're my property. You will show proper respect." But even as she said it, the words felt hollow, powerless. How do you threaten someone who has already died? How do you control someone who has nothing left to fear? Sara tilted her head slightly, studying Margaret like Margaret might study a problematic entry in her ledger. "I don't hate you, Mrs. Sutton. I probably should, but I don't. I understand you. You're a product of your time, of this system. You were taught that people like me are property, that our lives have monetary value and nothing more. You're doing what you think is right, what makes sense within your worldview. She took a step closer to the desk, and Margaret resisted the urge to lean back, to put more distance between them. But you're wrong. And what happened to me, what I experienced, proves you're wrong. I died because you calculated that saving me would cost more than I was worth. $5 versus $250. Not worth it. Let her die. Sarah's voice remained calm, almost conversational, which somehow made her words cut deeper. You put a price on my life. You do it every day with everyone here. You calculate our value like we're livestock or equipment. But human lives don't have prices, Mrs. Sutton. They're infinite. They're priceless. And when you treat them as commodities, when you let people die over money, there are consequences. Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. I will not be lectured by a child. I will not be made to feel guilty for making practical business decisions. This plantation doesn't run on sentiment and feelings. It runs on mathematics and economics. Resources are limited. Choices have to be made. Not everyone can be saved. That's reality. You're right, Sarah said, her voice maddeningly calm. Resources are limited. Choices do have to be made, but the choices you make define who you are. They define your soul. And you chose to let a 9-year-old girl die rather than spend $5 on medicine. That choice says everything about who you are, Mrs. Sutton. That choice will follow you for the rest of your life. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. You asked what I want, why I came back. I came back to make you see, to make you understand what you've done, what you do every day. I came back to be a reminder that you can't just erase people who aren't profitable enough. I came back to haunt your conscience until you either change or it destroys you. Sarah walked out of the study, leaving Margaret standing there, trembling with rage and fear and something else she refused to name. Behind her, Briggs was pale and sweating, his hands on his pistols, looking like he wanted to shoot Sarah, but was too afraid to try after last night's failure. Dr. Merritt was staring at his hands, at the instruments of his profession that had proven useless for diagnosing the most important patient he had ever examined. The three of them sat in silence for a long time after Sarah left. Finally, Briggs spoke, his voice rough. We should kill her tonight. Make it look like an accident, a fall, a snake bite, something natural. She's too dangerous to leave alive. She's going to destroy everything here. Margaret considered this, and the fact that she seriously considered murdering a 9-year-old child showed how far they had fallen, how desperate they had become. But she shook her head. No, killing her would make her a martyr, would make the story even bigger and more powerful. Dead, she becomes a legend. Alive, she's just a confused child we can discredit over time. She didn't add what she was really thinking. That trying to kill Sarah might not work. That bullets missed her for reasons they couldn't explain. That maybe she couldn't be killed by normal means. Better not to try and fail again. Better to pretend everything was normal and hope that eventually people would forget, that life would return to routine, that this would all fade into memory like a bad dream. But Blackwood Plantation would never be normal again. The next few days proved that beyond doubt. Strange things started happening, small things at first that could be dismissed as coincidence or imagination. The dogs refused to go near Sarah. They would bark at her from a distance, but wouldn't approach even when commanded, even when tempted with food. They would cower and whimper if forced close to her, their tails tucked, their bodies trembling. Horses became skittish when she passed. Calm, well-trained animals that never spooked would suddenly rear and try to bolt if Sarah came within 20 feet of them. The plantation had to stop using certain paths because horses refused to go near the slave quarters where Sarah lived. Even the chickens reacted strangely. The ones whose coop was closest to Sarah's cabin stopped laying eggs. They would pace nervously, refusing to roost, making distressed sounds day and night. After 3 days, they had to be moved to a different location before they died from stress. The plants in the field where Sarah had collapsed began to wither. A section about 20 feet across turned brown and died despite adequate water and careful tending. The cotton bolls shriveled. The leaves curled and fell off within a week. That spot was completely barren, while everything around it grew normally. Workers avoided that area, refused to work there, even when ordered, claiming they felt watched or threatened, claiming the ground itself rejected them. And people started getting sick. It began with Dr. Merritt. On August 20th, just one day after Sara's return, he developed a persistent cough. By the 21st, he had a fever. By the 22nd, he was in bed struggling to breathe. The symptoms looked exactly like pneumonia, the same disease that had killed Sara. Dr. Merritt, lying in his bed, listening to fluid building in his lungs, recognized the symptoms with growing horror. He had pronounced Sara dead of this disease. He had watched her die, or thought he had, and now he was dying of the same thing. The irony was not lost on him. By August 23rd, Dr. Merritt was too weak to get out of bed. He coughed constantly, bringing up blood and fluid that had the same sickly sweet smell he remembered from Sara's final hours. He knew he should send for another doctor, should get medicine, should try to fight the disease that was consuming him. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Part of him, a growing part, believed this was justice. He had failed Sara. He had been lazy and careless and had valued her life less than the cost of medicine. Now he was paying the price. Esther watched the sickness spread with grim understanding. She had seen patterns like this before, though never so clear, never so focused. In her grandmother's stories, people who wronged the dead often faced consequences. Sometimes it was sickness that struck them down. Sometimes it was bad luck or madness or death itself reaching out to claim what it had been denied. The ancestors didn't forget. Her grandmother used to say, they waited and watched, and when the time was right, they reminded you of your debts. By August 25th, 3 more white staff members had fallen ill with the same symptoms. All had been involved in Sara's death in some way. The cook who had prepared Margaret's dinner while Sara lay dying. The maid who had helped carry her body to the grave. The stable hand who had dug her grave. All of them sick, all of them coughing and feverish, all of them experiencing the same slow suffocation that had claimed Sara's life. Margaret herself began to feel unwell on August 26th, a headache that wouldn't go away, a cough that seemed to come from deep in her chest, a fever that made her shiver despite the heat. She tried to ignore it, tried to focus on running the plantation, tried to maintain the fiction that everything was normal. But it was getting harder and harder to pretend. Briggs was the only one who seemed to be unaffected, though. Whether that was luck or protection from some darker force, he didn't know. He stayed in his house, barricaded with his weapons, venturing out only when absolutely necessary. He had stopped going to the fields entirely, leaving the other overseers to handle the daily supervision. He was afraid, terrified in a way he had never been before. Every shadow seemed to hide a small figure. Every sound seemed to be footsteps approaching. Every night he dreamed of that moment when Sara had looked at him with those dark, bottomless eyes and promised consequences. The enslaved workers watched the sickness spread with a mixture of fear and satisfaction. They had seen people die before, often at the hands of the very people who were now suffering. They had been beaten and whipped and starved and worked to death while their tormentors thrived. Now the tables were turning, and even those who believed in forgiveness felt a deep sense of justice being served. Daniel was the most vocal about his feelings. You see what happens when you throw people away like garbage, he said to the other workers one evening. You see what happens when you decide someone isn't worth saving. Death sends them back, and they remember everything. They remember every beating, every insult, every moment they were treated like less than human. Esther was more cautious, as she had been her whole life. This isn't about punishment, she said quietly. It's about restoration. Sara came back to remind us of who we are, who we've always been. We're not property. We're human beings with souls and dignity. The white folks can't change that, no matter how hard they try. They can make us suffer, but they can't make us less than what we are. Sara herself spent most of her time in the cabin, sitting quietly, rarely speaking. She seemed to be waiting for something, though she didn't say what. She would sometimes walk through the fields, her small figure moving slowly between the rows of cotton, and the plants would seem to bow toward her, to lean in her direction as if seeking her presence. The barren patch where she had collapsed remained dead, but the ground around it seemed to thrive, growing more vigorously than anywhere else on the plantation. The sickness continued to spread through the white community at Blackwood, but it touched none of the enslaved people. Not a single worker developed a cough or fever. Not a single child showed signs of illness. The disease seemed to know exactly who it was meant to affect, targeting only those who had participated in or benefited from Sara's death. On August 28th, Dr. Merritt died. He had been sick for 8 days, and his body had given up the fight. His final moments were spent alone in his room, coughing up blood and fluid, gasping for breath that wouldn't come. The irony of his death was noted by everyone at Blackwood. He had died of the same disease he had failed to treat in Sara. He had been killed by the very condition he had dismissed as not worth treating. His last words, according to the woman who found him, were a whispered apology to no one in particular. "I should have saved her. I should have tried. $5, such a small amount for a life." The deaths continued. The stable hand went next, followed by the cook, followed by the maid. Each death brought fresh fear to the remaining white residents of Blackwood. They could see the pattern clearly now. The disease was targeting everyone who had been involved in Sara's death, everyone who had shown indifference to her suffering. And it was only a matter of time before it reached the ones who had actively participated in her fate. Margaret Sutton lay in her bed, her body burning with fever, her lungs filling with fluid, and she knew that she would be next. She had tried everything. She had called for other doctors, had taken every medicine they recommended, had prayed and bargained and promised to change. But nothing helped. The disease seemed to have a will of its own, a purpose that no medicine could deflect. She thought about Sara, about the child she had dismissed as not worth saving, about the $5 of medicine she had refused to spend, about the grave behind the barn where she had been buried like an animal. And Margaret knew, with certainty that had nothing to do with fever or delirium, that this was her punishment. She had valued a human life at less than $5. She had made a calculation that put profit above compassion. And now she was paying the price. On September 1st, Margaret Sutton sent for Sara. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, to ask to see the child she had let die, to face the consequences of her choices. But she was dying, and she knew it, and she needed to say something before it was too late. Sara came to the plantation house, walking through the halls that had once terrified her. She moved with the same quiet dignity she had shown since her return, her small face expressionless as she entered Margaret's bedroom and stood beside the bed. Margaret looked up at her, this child who had died and come back, this impossible creature who had somehow survived what no one should survive. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "I should have saved you. I should have tried. $5. I was so wrong, so terribly wrong." Sara looked down at her with those old knowing eyes. "You were wrong, Mrs. Sutton, but you know that now. You understand what I meant when I said human lives don't have prices. I understand." Margaret gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I understand now. I was so focused on profit, on making the plantation successful, that I forgot what really mattered. I forgot that the people working for me were human beings, with souls and dignity and worth beyond any ledger entry." "Good," Sara said softly. "That's what I needed you to understand. That's why I came back, not to punish you, not to seek revenge, but to make you see, to make everyone see. There are things more important than money, Mrs. Sutton. There are things that can't be calculated or measured. And when we forget that, when we let greed and profit blind us to what matters most, we lose our humanity." She reached out and touched Margaret's hand, her small fingers cool against the fevered skin. "You're dying, Mrs. Sutton. There's no medicine that can save you now. But you're dying knowing the truth, and that means something. That means you'll be remembered differently than if you had died in ignorance." Margaret's breath was coming in rag gasps now, each one more difficult than the last. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for making me see." Sara nodded slowly. "Rest now, Mrs. Sutton. There's peace waiting for you. Just rest." She stayed by the bed as Margaret Sutton's breathing grew more labored, as the fluid filled her lungs completely as she struggled for air that wouldn't come, and when the final breath left Margaret's body at 8:35 p.m. on September 1st, exactly 17 days after Sara's own death at the same hour. Sara was there to witness it. The exact time was not a coincidence, and everyone at Blackwood knew it. With Margaret's death, the leadership of Blackwood Plantation fell into chaos. She had no living relatives, no heirs to take over the property. The plantation was now in legal limbo, its ownership uncertain. Briggs tried to assert control, claiming that as overseer he had authority to manage the property until a new owner could be appointed, but no one was willing to follow him. The sickness had made him a broken man, terrified and paranoid, incapable of leading anyone. The enslaved workers saw their opportunity. For the first time in their lives, there was no one to tell them what to do, no one to force them into the fields, no one to threaten them with punishment. They gathered in the quarters, holding an informal meeting, discussing what they should do next. Some wanted to leave, to flee to freedom, to escape the plantation that had been their prison for so long. Others wanted to stay, to claim the land for themselves, to build something new on the foundation of their suffering. Daniel stood before the crowd, his voice strong and clear. We've been given a chance that none of us ever thought we'd have. The people who owned us are dead or dying. The system that held us captive is broken. What we do now is up to us. We can run away and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders, afraid of being caught and returned to slavery. Or we can stay here, claim this land as our own, and build something better. Esther stepped forward, her old voice trembling but determined. Daniel is right. We have a chance to make things right, to prove that we can be free, that we can build a community based on something other than greed and cruelty. Sara showed us that. Sara died and came back to show us that we're worth more than any price anyone could put on us. Now we have to prove it to ourselves. Sara herself spoke only briefly, but her words carried weight that no one could ignore. I didn't come back to punish, she said softly. I came back to show you what's possible. I came back to remind you that death isn't the end, that justice exists even when we can't see it, that hope is never truly lost. Now you have to decide what you want to do with that knowledge. Now you have to build a future worth living in. The decision was made to stay, to claim the plantation for themselves, to divide the land among the families who had worked it for generations, to create a community based on equality and mutual respect. It wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, threats from outside, legal battles that might take years to resolve. But they were free, truly free, for the first time in their lives. And that freedom was worth fighting for. Briggs fled the plantation on September 3rd, slipping away in the middle of the night with his weapons and what supplies he could carry. He was never seen again in Mississippi, though rumors would surface over the years of a broken man wandering through the South, always looking over his shoulder, always seeing shadows move in the corner of his vision. Some said he died in a ditch somewhere, consumed by the madness that had overtaken him. Others claimed he had made his way west, trying to outrun the consequences of his past. The remaining white staff members left as well, some voluntarily, others driven out by the new order that had been established. By the end of September, Blackwood Plantation was entirely in the hands of the formerly enslaved people who had renamed it something new, something that represented hope and rebirth rather than suffering and exploitation. The transformation wasn't easy. There were arguments and disagreements, moments when old patterns threatened to reassert themselves. But they worked through it, building a new society from the ruins of the old. They divided the land fairly, established rules for sharing resources, created a system of governance that gave everyone a voice. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and complicated and sometimes frustrating, but it was theirs. Sara remained with the community, though she had changed in ways that no one could fully understand. She spoke less and less as the months passed, spending more time alone, walking through the fields or sitting in the forest that bordered the plantation. She seemed to be fading, her body growing weaker, even as her spirit seemed to grow stronger. It was as if the energy that had brought her back from death was slowly being spent, depleted by the purpose it had served. Esther watched over her as she always had, but she knew that Sara wouldn't be with them for much longer. The child who had died and come back had fulfilled her purpose, had shown everyone what was possible, had set in motion a transformation that would ripple outward far beyond Blackwood. Now she was ready to return to the place she had come from. "I'm tired, Esther," Sara said one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "I think it's time for me to go back. I came to do something, and I've done it now. I need to rest." Esther's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "I know, child. I know. You've done more than any of us could have imagined. You've given us hope, shown us that we're worth more than anyone ever told us." "You've changed everything?" Sara smiled, a small, peaceful smile that seemed to light up her tired face. "I didn't change anything. I just reminded everyone of what they already knew. that human lives don't have prices, that justice exists even when we can't see it, that hope is always possible no matter how dark things seem. She closed her eyes and lay back on her sleeping mat, her breathing growing shallower and shallower. Esther held her hand, feeling the life slowly drain away from the small body, knowing that this time there would be no return. This time Sara was going somewhere she would stay. As the sun set on October 15th, 1856, exactly 2 months after her resurrection, Sara Sutton died for the second and final time. She was 9 years old. She had lived her entire life in slavery, died of neglect, returned from the dead to bring justice to her oppressors, and had finally found peace. Her body was buried in the new cemetery that the community had established, a proper grave with a marker that reads simply, Sara Sutton, 1847-1856. She came back to show us what we're worth. Well, the story of Blackwood Plantation, of the girl who died and came back, spread far beyond the borders of Mississippi. It traveled through the networks that connected enslaved people across the South, passed along in whispers and songs and secret gatherings. It became a symbol of hope, proof that the oppressors could be defeated, that justice would eventually find its way. Some said the story was just a legend, a folk tale invented to give enslaved people hope in impossible circumstances. Others believed it was true, passed down through generations as a testament to the power of faith and the certainty of justice. The truth, as is often the case with such stories, was somewhere in between. Blackwood Plantation, renamed Freedom's Dawn by the people who claimed it, survived and thrived. The community that Sara had helped create grew and flourished, becoming a symbol of what was possible when people were allowed to be free. The land that had been built on suffering became a place of hope, a reminder that even the darkest times could be overcome. And Sara Sutton, the girl who had been valued at $250, who had been denied $5 of medicine, who had died and been buried behind the barn like garbage, became a legend. Her story was told and retold, changing with each telling but always retaining its core truth, that human lives have infinite value, that justice exists even when we can't see it, that hope is never truly lost. The grave behind the barn, where Sara had been buried after her first death, was transformed into a memorial. The barren patch where she had collapsed in the field became a garden planted with flowers that bloomed year after year, their colors bright against the dark soil. And every year on August 15th, the anniversary of her death, the community gathered to remember her, to tell her story, to renew their commitment to the values she had represented. Margaret Sutton's ledgers, those meticulous records of human beings as property, were preserved as a reminder of what had been, of the system that had valued profit over people, of the calculations that had led to so much suffering. They served as a warning, a testament to the danger of reducing human beings to numbers in a column. Dr. Merritt's medical records, with their clinical detachment and their dismissal of Sara's life as not worth saving, were also preserved. They showed the cost of indifference, the price of seeing people as assets rather than as fellow human beings. They served as a reminder that doctors had a responsibility to treat all patients, regardless of their race or status or value in someone's ledger. Coleman Briggs, wherever he ended up, became a figure of caution in the stories told by enslaved people. He was the overseer who thought he could break anyone, who believed that cruelty was strength, who had been brought low by a child. His fate was a warning to all those who used violence and intimidation to maintain control, that such methods would ultimately fail, that the oppressed would eventually rise, that cruelty always comes back to haunt those who practice it. But the legacy of Sara Sutton was not just about punishment or revenge. It was about hope and transformation and the possibility of a better world. It was about the idea that even in the darkest circumstances, even when all seemed lost, something could change. Someone could return from the dead and show everyone what they were worth. The community she had helped create continued to grow and evolve, adapting to the changing world while holding on to the principles she had represented. They welcomed others who came seeking freedom, built relationships with neighboring communities, created a new way of life that honored the past while embracing the future. They educated their children, taught them to read and write, gave them the opportunities that had been denied to their parents and grandparents. And they never forgot Sara. Her story was woven into the fabric of their identity, passed down from generation to generation, a reminder of where they had come from and what they had overcome. She became more than a person. She became a symbol, an idea, a promise that justice would eventually find its way, that hope would never be extinguished, that human beings would always be worth more than any price someone might put on them. The girl who had been valued at $250, who had been denied $5 of medicine, who had been buried behind the barn like garbage, had become priceless. She had become a legend, testament to the power of faith and the certainty of justice. And her story, whispered and sung and told around fires for generations, reminded everyone who heard it that they were worth more than any price, that no amount of money could measure the value of a human soul, that death was not the end, and that hope was never truly lost.